Welcome to a new episode of Mind Your Mind podcast. I'm Roxana Parra Sepulveda, your host, and today I have the pleasure to be with Alison O'Connor. Alison O'Connor is a Churchill Fellow from 2016 in moral injury, trauma recovery, and the arts. She is a writer, trainer, and therapist with 30 years' experience in health, community and arts settings, and with military veterans and survivors of complex trauma and moral injury. Alison has extensive experience of working reflectively with professionals from diverse disciplines, guiding them to deepen their self-understanding and extend their emotional, social, and relational intelligence. Alison, thank you so very much for being here with me talking about this incredible theme, moral injury. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Roxana, and thank you for the invitation to be on your podcast. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me too, because I have been thinking about this and wanting to have someone in the podcast to tell us about moral injury and talk through the solutions as well that you are sort of exploring. And so, yes, thank you for being here. This is a very exciting moment for me in the process of doing the podcast. So why don't we tell everybody what is moral injury?
The term moral injury sort of first came into being in the way that we now understand it from back in the 90s. Jonathan Shea was a military psychiatrist and he was working with Vietnam veterans. And at that time, sort of the 80s and 90s, post-traumatic stress was having a real, heyday in terms of, people were really understanding what it was and how it showed up. And so lots of approaches to helping veterans recover from conflict were focusing on that, what was called at that point PTSD. But Jonathan Shea and his colleagues started to notice, and the military veterans they were working with were aware of this themselves, that while many people were recovering and getting better, many weren't. And what they started to realize was that actually what was troubling people the most and causing people the most distress was the moral impact of their experiences. And so Jonathan Shea developed this kind of definition of moral injury, that it was the deep psychological and emotional suffering that came from a betrayal of what's right. And I think that's a really important phrase for us. We think about moral injury, a betrayal of what's right by someone in authority. Okay, so that was the first definition we had.
Mm-hmm.
But he was really careful as well to in his writing about this, to convey that while this language might be fairly new and quite
Mm-hmm.
modern,
Mm-hmm.
actually he believes that it is an ancient condition, that this is something that people have struggled with, for probably as far back as humans have existed. And he links the experiences of the Vietnam veterans he worked with to the work of Homer in the Iliad with Achilles. One of his books is called Achilles in Vietnam. Um, there was also then, shortly afterwards, or sort of about 10 years later, another definition by Brett Litz and his colleagues, who again were working with military personnel, and
Mm-hmm.
they defined moral injury as the distress and the suffering caused from perpetrating, witnessing, or experiencing acts that violate one's moral code. So
I see.
essentially, this idea that moral injury is something that we might experience when we're um, perhaps through our work, and I know we'll talk about this more afterwards, I'm sure, thinking about how this shows up in frontline professions. But when somebody is is forced to or obligated to behave in a way that goes against their moral compass, or to witness or be on the receiving end of acts that violate their moral compass. And it has been referred to as a soul wound. And for me, I think that really kind of captures the depth of suffering that we're talking about with moral injury, so that it's not I suppose, like a cognitive, or a sort of surface level pain. It is that really deep kind of distress that can come
Mm.
from a sense of something being on a really deep sort of existential level, really fundamentally wrong.
Yes, and so it touched so deeply that that also is closely linked. The way that I am understanding it as well is that it's closely linked with your moral compass, no? And
Yeah.
that's been challenged somehow. But the interesting aspect as well of this is that is through your work. This is something that for a reason that because the position, the role that you are exercising in that moment, and here is where what we think about frontline workers,
Yeah.
you find yourself in a situation, in a position in which you see that something is needed, something is necessary, but you cannot provide it. You don't have the resources. Is that right?
Yeah.
Who, or probably we can also think about who is affected by it, no?
Yeah, for sure. So while this sort of research and understanding was being developed in the military context around moral
Mhm.
injury, in the field of nursing, the term moral distress has been used for
I
quite a
see.
few decades, so back as far as the
Uh-huh.
1980s. And moral distress in nursing or in healthcare, and this is also now, as our understanding widens, applicable to lots of frontline professions. We understand moral distress as occurring when somebody knows the right thing to do, but is
I see.
institutionally, or in terms of the resources or the limitations of their role, unable to do it. So, for example, in the COVID pandemic, this, while, moral injury and moral distress were understood well before then, it was really during the pandemic that this became a really widely understood phenomenon, because many frontline professionals, whether that was, in a hospital setting, in child protection, in the prison system, policing, was suddenly confronted with a reality that was incredibly morally challenging.
Mm.
Um, Now, I would argue, I don't know if you'd agree, that most frontline professions are inherently morally challenging. There are often sort of complex moral questions that come up. We're often operating in areas where there are limited resources, and, the financial constraints are very real. So moral challenge is kind of always there, but in during the pandemic, it was really heightened. And so the instances of moral distress were far greater. And, really we can understand that this as a continuum of some moral challenge, which in itself is not necessarily harmful to our well-being. In fact, I've been having some conversations with a whole range of frontline practitioners, excuse me, for a book that I'm writing at the moment.
Uh-huh.
And it's a really interesting theme that's come up is quite a lot of people saying that the moral complexity of their work and the moral challenge is actually something that they enjoy and can thrive on. So I think that's really worth noting, that it isn't, there's nothing inherently bad about moral challenge and moral complexity. Um, However, further down the continuum is moral distress, which again is very common and very normal, because most of us who work in frontline settings, we're there because we want to make a difference, we want to help people, so we are highly likely, I would say, to be impacted by the limitations that we encounter. So that might lead to moral distress. And what we're now really understanding more and more is that for moral distress, if we can provide spaces where that can be shared, reflected on, debriefed, explored, normalized, we can hopefully prevent that from becoming moral injury. So going back to Jonathan Shea, who first, gave us the term, he described he said that he felt the suffering of that cohort, the Vietnam cohort,
Mm-hmm.
was was so great because they didn't have opportunity to communalize their experiences. And I really love
Uh-huh.
that word he uses,
Mm-hmm.
so there wasn't space for them to come together and to discover or realize that actually the pain, the moral wounding they were experiencing was not theirs alone. It was being felt by hundreds, thousands of their,
Mm.
peers. But people were retreating and, keeping that. So it developed into shame. And, unfortunately, we do know now there's a strong correlation between moral injury and suicide.
I
So
see.
this
Uh-huh.
is a really important issue, I believe, that we need to be mindful of and hopefully preventative about. And I think, and this is what I'm exploring in my book, one of the most preventative things we can do is provide reflective spaces where this can be normalized and where that moral weight can be shared. Where people can say, for example, um, one of the things that caused a lot of moral distress, which did for many people become moral injury
Mm-hmm.
during the pandemic, were those impossible decisions that many practitioners were facing. An example, in a health setting, 10 patients who needed urgent treatment, only 4 ventilators. The impossibility of that decision for someone who's spent their whole career wanting to save lives,
Exactly.
Yeah, so different but connected moral challenges across other professions.
And this is so many elements on what you're saying, no, that I want to highlight. One of them is that here in Mind Your Mind, we're an absolute supporters of reflective spaces.
Yeah.
I think that reflective spaces are really essential because there is so much isolation, not only in the way that these decisions sometimes have to be taken, but also in the working context. And then we go into the experience, the way that people will be experiencing the feelings associated to all of these challenges. The isolation of that experience creates even more, as you were saying, no shame and other feelings that will make things more complex. And what is interesting as well, from what I'm hearing from what you're saying, is this existential element of what it is, no, this continuum in that goes into moral injury, and how much the correlation is there with suicide as well, no. So that is
Yeah.
telling us on how deep this problem can affect someone, no. It's
Yeah.
very profound. And also makes me think about the importance of that challenges that we need to grow in
Mm.
our professions, no,
Yeah.
when we are working with decisions that are always, that I call it, being in the gray area. No,
Yeah.
you have to be making decisions in the gray area. It's not white or black. No, it's always something that you need to ponder so many elements. And when you are already in challenging context, the situations and dealing with context, with complex needs and multiple needs that someone may have, you have to ponder so many elements that creates quite a difficulty in terms of the type of decisions that one has to make. But this is also what makes us grow in our experience, in our professions.
Sure.
And it's a mix of how those decisions are made and how much support we can get actually to make those decisions and at least reflect upon it as well.
Absolutely agree. And I was really thinking as you were speaking then, Roxana, about that the loneliness of decision making and of holding that weight.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and, you know, one of the things that has really emerged through the conversations I've been having with people is that, you know, one of the sort of, I guess, legacies of the COVID pandemic is that many people, um, thinking particularly in like social work, criminal
Hmm.
justice work, who previously, pre-pandemic, would have worked in a shared office, in a team, yeah. Obviously, we know lots of people were, you know, working from home during the pandemic, but also lots of people have never gone back. So many people now
Yes.
are working remotely. So what they're lacking, and missing out on, as I've been hearing, is that space, say after a really tough home visit, for example, you know, to come back into a space and just be able to just, you know, have that, um, let, letting go of some of the worry. Did I say the right thing? Did I do the right thing? And that being, you know, that kind of informal debriefing. So that for many people has not is not there anymore. Um, and also, in terms of just time capacities, you know, just being able to have that space to take a break or, you know, check in with a colleague. So I think the loneliness you name is really valid. And I love the way you put that about, you know, in our professions, we also need space to keep growing. And one of the things that's really hopeful, I think, about what we're discovering about moral injury, which is really, in terms of research, still in its early days, is this link with moral repair. That's the term that's tended to be used. Um, Moral repair and recovery is the link between that and post-traumatic growth. So,
Uh-huh.
you know, we're learning that if people are given the right sort of conditions, support, reflective space to grieve for what has been lost to moral
Mm.
injury. And there's some, you know, really beautiful writing. Rita Nakashima Brock is a wonderful writer. She has a book called Soul Repair. And she and her colleague, Gabriella Latini, they actually set up in America a truth commission for moral injury, you know, where based on the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation program, where collectively stories could be heard and witnessed and grieving could take place for what has been lost. So thinking back to the post-traumatic growth, if that the injury, if the moral wounding is acknowledged and people are supported to repair and recover, we are now learning that a deeper sense of meaning and connection to the world, you know,
Mm.
may flourish. So obviously not to, you know, minimize the suffering, but to acknowledge that we can grow from these really challenging and painful experiences.
Exactly. I was about to say, no, that growth may happen with others, no, in fact. And
Definitely.
because also this kind of pain and distress and this type of injuries, if we think in post-traumatic growth as well, it it feeds the need of isolation
Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah.
through shame or through all sorts of feelings that will create this sense of this is only me. I have made a mistake, or this is
Yeah.
on me only, no? But it's
Yeah.
until we start to see as well and hear and listen the stories of others that probably have been in kind of similar situations, then is when we can start to reflect with a little bit more of self-compassion, I would say, and a little bit more self-understanding what is happening, no, or what has happened in the
Yeah.
process, how that is affecting me in the present. Because
Yeah.
also this is something that has an effect through time, no? That's what we
Mm.
are talking in terms of the continuum that you are explaining. I'm hearing this element of time, and it's also time what is needed for healing and for
Yeah.
growing and for grief of what
Yeah.
has been lost as well, no? And in that process
Absolutely.
there is so much self-compassion needed and patience with oneself as well, right?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Um, I think in many ways, moral injury is a kind of reflective condition. It's something that often, when you were saying time there, like I worked for a while in the Veterans NHS service that we have here in Wales. And
Mm-hmm.
I worked with several people there who were in their 70s, and they had served in the military when they were in their late teens and 20s. So we're talking like 50 years on for some of them. And it was only now at this point that they
Mm.
were able to voice some of this, deep pain, moral pain that they've unfortunately lived their entire lives with. And I think a really key part of the work, thinking of those people, but also other people that I've known, is having this language, having this terminology,
Yes.
to put a name to what they're feeling. Like one person said to me, I knew that this wasn't just, this was this person's words, PTSD. I knew it was something deeper, but I didn't have the name for it. And, so I think where we're at in terms of moral injury. And that was also echoed. I'm just remembering this in a health professional I spoke with recently. And she said, I thought I was going mad because
Mm.
I just kept getting so distressed, so angry. And she said, when I discovered this, this concept of moral injury, I just felt this huge relief because I then knew I wasn't going mad. This is a real thing. Um, and there was a survey that the BMA did with doctors just
Mm-hmm.
after the pandemic, asking people about the terms moral distress and moral injury. And I think it was a high percentage of doctors did not know those terms. They weren't familiar with them. But when they
Uh-huh.
were explained to them, 80% said, this absolutely is, this resonates with my experience. This is what I am, So I think there's something for me hopeful and helpful in just sharing this language, because I think what it really does, one of the reasons I'm so drawn to moral injury as a concept is I think it's a really compassionate way of approaching um, suffering that our work can bring, because we're used to this culture, aren't we? In frontline professions of we need to be resilient, we
Yes.
just need to cope better, and if we develop better coping skills, we'll be okay. And actually, what moral injury does is it takes that responsibility away from the individual, and it acknowledges that this is a systemic issue. That, okay, when we ask people to work in contexts that really challenge their moral compass and their fundamental sense of what is right and proper, it is likely to hurt them. And that is not an individual weakness. It's not about, I should be stronger, I should be more resilient. It's actually, if anything, it's a sign that we have a robust moral conscience. So,
Yes.
Yeah. Um, and this is that there's quite a it's a timely moment for moral injury because just at the end of last year, for the
Uh-huh.
first time, the phrase moral problems has been included in the latest iteration of the DSM.
I see.
So,
Okay.
yeah. So for some people, this is seen as, okay, this is hopeful because it's being acknowledged as this is a serious issue. So we're not at the place where moral injury is being classed as a mental health problem, but it's being acknowledged now that moral problems can lead to mental health difficulties.
Yes.
So while I can see the value of that, I do have, and I know this is shared by many people in the field, I do have a concern that we may be on a slope to moral injury being pathologized and being
Yeah.
seen as a mental health condition. And for me, that's really troubling. Because I understand it, as many others do, as a very human, condition, as actually as a human response
Um,
to, to inhumane circumstances. So I think, I know there's a really robust discussion emerging around this. But I think the thought that troubles me the most is that we might get to a place where it becomes acknowledged as a mental health condition. And then, as we know, that is a trajectory to
mm,
medication being an answer.
medication.
Yeah,
And that's yeah, and I totally agree with you and share profoundly this idea that how damaging then things can be when they go just into that place of pathologizing and linking it then with just a pill that will help to resolve something. No, when we are talking about that is related to a human response that is also adaptative, that has something to do with that way of responding into in front of a situation that is so challenging and is challenging at such a core level,
yeah,
which is our moral compass, no?
yeah,
And how much then in that of creating a sort of an element of pathology attached to it creates even more isolation, in my view, potentially
yeah,
even more difficulties for people actually to say, this is what I am experiencing. I'm trying to understand this. And what I really value from what you were saying as well is that through these definitions and the history attached to it as well allow us to see that actually when we start to put words that gives a little bit of a meaning to
yeah,
our experiences, things start to become easier to understand and to
yeah,
bear in a way. No, the situation will not be resolved, but obviously we will be able to understand why and how we get to feel the way we feel
yeah,
through understanding that this is something that is being seen as well and studied and understood from a completely different angle. So there is a very dangerous element as well in pathologizing such a natural and human response. The human suffering inevitably will create being witness of human suffering and difficult circumstances, and us being in the position of having to do something about it
mm,
is a very tough position to have. It's a very difficult role to have.
absolutely. And I think you're so right there, Roxana, the way you talked about it's not about being able to resolve it. I think having this sort of understand this language allows us to be with the idea of acceptance that
Yes.
actually, as you say, when we witness profound immorality, profound wrongdoing, it is painful, and I think where we're at in the world right now is is deeply distressing. For me, I find it morally distressing,
Mm.
to know that so much injustice is taking place and so much horror in the world, and to
Mm.
able to kind of, witness it, which I want to, but to tolerate at times, the helplessness, I find really
Exactly.
painful.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but in a way, you know, I am grateful that it's painful, because if I was watching these things and not being moved, I don't know what kind of
That
person
will
I
be
would be.
alarming. Yes,
Yeah.
definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. That and
Yes.
that is what can happen as well, because we naturally may numb,
Yeah. Yeah.
ourselves in the process. And when we are consistently dealing with these kind of situations, to get to that point also will be a
Yeah.
sign that people need to, pay attention to. If I'm
Yeah.
not feeling something, then there is
Yeah.
something to think about with the right support as well. And I'm thinking about how useful it can be a holistic approach to this. Thinking about mind, body, spirituality,
Yeah.
different areas of what it means to be human, and how we can approach and address moral injury. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, lovely. Thank you for the question. So I actually encountered the concept of moral injury when I had a Churchill Fellowship. You mentioned back in 2016, and I was
Hmm.
at that point. So my background is originally in theatre and the arts and storytelling, and then I trained as a therapist alongside that. So I was in America and also in Bosnia, looking at ways in which um, artistic approaches to trauma recovery were helping people with expression and healing. And it was
I
through
see.
that I was introduced to the concept of moral injury. So back in, I think, 2022, I came together with two other Churchill Fellows, Sophie Redlin and Simon Edwards. Sophie's fellowship had been looking at the use of talking circles with Indigenous Native American elders. And Simon's had been looking at moral injury through retreat programs and post traumatic growth. So we came together, it was during the pandemic, and we were kind of, as many of us were, how can we help? How can we be of most service in this moment? And we put together a small pilot, which was a retreat
Uh-huh.
using talking circles. For our first pilot was for nurses and one care home manager. And really, what we tried to do was just take the essence of Jonathan Shea's word communalize and just create a space that was not in any way pathologizing people's experiences. It was non hierarchical. We were in the circle as humans, and we invited people to just share their experiences over 3 days. So we it was away in a residential setting, and since then we've sort of run this 4 times with. So the invitation has been for professionals from any frontline background. So we've had people
Uh-huh.
come who were military personnel, a military chaplain, police, some of them academia, nursing. So this wonderful sort of cross section of frontline staff. And really, what has happened has just been this wonderful experience of compassionate witnessing. So
Uh-huh.
there's been no, when we're really, we're really clear. This is not, we don't think this is therapy. It's certainly not treatment. It is a human coming together. It's facilitated and held by myself, Sophie, and Simon.
Mhm.
Um, but really, the power is in people sharing their stories,
Mm.
receiving compassion from others, which
Mm.
is helping people to experience self-compassion.
Mm.
And one component of the retreat that in our evaluation people have shared was very helpful is a forgiveness circle. So one of the
Uh-huh.
things that we know about moral injury is that it can lead to really strong levels of both self and other blame. And
I
people,
see.
while at times that may be valid, um, when people get stuck in that place, as we know, that can, be really harmful. So this was an exercise, a ritual really, which Sophie had permission from an elder who she trained with, gave her permission to share this exercise with us. And it invites people to think really deeply about whether there is anything they would like to both forgive themselves for and forgive someone else for. And in in an experiential and ritual based way, we create the conditions for that to be heard and to be held. So that's just, I suppose, an example really of that way of working, which does it's quite a long way from the medical model. We
Yes.
kind we invite people to think about when we sit in a circle as humans, what ancestors they may be bringing with them, so that we carry that strength and wisdom with us. We also may carry the wounds intergenerationally. So
Yes.
we in the retreats, and the program is called Reflect and Renew, we are
Uh-huh.
inviting people to bring their whole selves, their personal, professional, spiritual self, and that, of course, that will mean different things to different people. But there's
Absolutely.
um, a kind of, just I'm aware that I'm jumping back and forth, but one of the that Jonathan Shea writes is that in his work, he kept hearing people who were morally injured use the phrase, I lost it. And we're talking about perhaps an experience or in a war zone of losing control, or when they come home,
Mm-hmm.
losing, unfortunately acting out with domestic violence with their
Yes.
families.
Yes.
And he kept hearing
Uh-huh.
this phrase, I lost it, I lost it. And when he started to ask people what the it was that was being lost, the answer time and again was my humanity. And so
Uh-huh.
he began to
Mm.
recognize that moral injury is connected to this loss of humanity, this loss of belief in ourselves and others as as good people, as good
Yes.
humans. And so one of the things in our retreat program that we've been, observing, feeling, and then reading about in the evaluations is people having a restored sense of humanity, of that ability to, on that really deep level, kind of trust. Okay, people are fundamentally good, and maybe
Yes.
even I am someone who is fundamentally good, but I've done some things which have really disappointed me in myself, and I feel bad about
Mm.
that, but I can you begin to try and accept some of those things.
Yes. And what are the findings that what other things have you found in the process of doing the reflect and renew?
Yes. So the main finding that we had, so five themes emerged from our evaluation, and the sort of the overarching theme was this idea of I am not alone. That was a
Uh-huh.
phrase that kept
Mm.
coming up in the
Okay.
research, the evaluation. People saying, as I listened to other stories of moral challenges, I realized I wasn't the only one holding this weight. I wasn't the only one feeling betrayed. So this idea of I'm not alone. So the shared humanity. Um,
Mm.
as people reported a deeper level of self compassion, um, a um, a sense of unburdening and letting go. That was another theme that emerged. So, and
Yeah.
a renewed. This is a really interesting one, which we were really pleased to see come out as a theme. A renewed sense of commitment to to their profession. So a kind of
Yes.
yeah, which I guess links with that post-traumatic growth we mentioned and that new sense of meaning, because, several people who have come on our retreats had been off work for a long time because they'd reached that point of not being able to cope and function anymore. And we're thinking, maybe that's it. Maybe I won't be able to go back to the
Yeah.
frontline work. But
Yeah.
through, reflection and the restorative nature of also through just from fully getting away, that was a key element. People said being, getting away from their
Space, the
space, time,
distance.
yes, time to go and walk in nature and actually do that deeper level of reflecting. Um, yes, several people said, I feel like I've got more to offer. I do want to go back to my role. I can, I can find a bit more perspective again. So we're sort of in a place with the retreats at the moment where we really want to carry on offering them, but we're also
Uh-huh.
really mindful that the need for reflective spaces, is, well, I think is there across
Enormous,
no
enormous, and across the board. Yes,
exactly.
I 100%
So
agree with you. Yeah.
so what we're kind of exploring, and this is partly what I'm writing about in the book I'm working on, is how do we support people, teams, organizations to really get to a place where we value and we embed and we protect time and space for reflection, so that it's not, as I know it is in lots of fields, it's a kind of, an additional luxury, maybe like, once or twice a year, we'll have a team day and do some
Exactly.
reflecting. But,
Exactly.
it has never made sense to me that those of us who work as counselors, therapists, psychologists, it's a given for us, isn't it, that we have reflective supervision
Yes.
every
Yes.
month.
Yes.
It's there. For me, that we expect police officers, firefighters, social workers to day after day face the complexity of human suffering and just kind of go home and I
Just
don't know.
yeah,
Yeah,
expect it to
suck it up.
be,
That's an awful
it's like,
saying.
yeah, well, yes, but also not really acknowledging the impact of that work, no,
Yeah.
and I agree with you. There is something about a change that needs to happen in different levels that are more systemic levels,
Yeah.
that organizational level, project management level, planning, budget level, that needs to happen in order for people to actually start to have these spaces, also allow themselves to use them, no,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
that's also something that we see, that
Yeah.
or that I see. I don't know if you
Yeah.
have come across this, Alison, but the fact that some people have the possibility to use a reflective space in an organization. And I've come across so many people that said, oh no, work
Yeah.
doesn't affect me. I'm
Yeah.
very good in departmentalizing, and this doesn't affect me. And I really want to encourage as well the people that is hearing us now.
Yeah.
If you do have the opportunity to have a reflective space within your organization, within the work that you're doing, please take it. Take it and use it for your own benefit,
Yeah.
because it will give you longevity. I think this element of
Mm.
renewing the connection with their own profession is quite deep as well, because so many times we link our professions with our identity. And,
Yes.
and in terms of who we are and what we want for life and etc. So it has such a big impact to use these little spaces, no, that may seem not a great deal of something, but
Yeah.
actually help that preventative element, that we don't need to get to times of crisis to
Yeah.
actually be able to work on that prevention, no? And there is no need to wait for a long need of being absent from work or any of that,
Yeah.
or feel that you cannot sleep or have any other symptoms, really, to actually start to take care of yourself way before. This is an
Mm.
act of love, self-love, I
Yes,
think, when we
absolutely agree.
allow ourselves this, no? But it also needs to be done in places where we can trust, where we can feel safe
Yeah.
to explore and reflect, right? So it's a complex task, but it also requires an act of trust and bravery in that way as well, no? Because it's to face something that is painful, and nobody wants to face something that is
Yeah.
painful. It's difficult to see it with our own pain sometimes, but it's necessary, right?
I love that description. Yeah, I absolutely agree about that
Mm,
complexity. And I think when you talked about us getting preventative, I think we have, haven't we? In terms of frontline professions, there's been a huge, I think, huge progress in acknowledging mental health and emotional health in frontline
yes.
workers. So,
Mm,
now there's much more provision than there was maybe 5, 10 years ago. So we've got some of that right. But the bits that are still, there's maybe the next wave in a way is, okay, how do we get to the stage, as you were saying, where we're helping people to stay well before they reach breaking point, so that we're not just reacting and saying, okay,
mm,
some sessions of therapy to help you recover. Let's try and help people stay as well as possible. Um, and acknowledging, I think, that culture shift around being human as well as professional.
mm,
So,
mm.
needing a reflective space, needing to share the weight of the work is not about us being not strong, not resilient, weak. It's actually just about being human.
Absolutely. We need to start to close for today, but before we get
Mm,
there, shall we just share at least one thing that an individual and an
mm.
organization can do to start with this preventative work of moral injury?
So I would really say the starting point is having conversations about these terms, about these concepts, just making this a normal thing to say. Oh, I found this morally challenging, or oh,
Mm.
what do you think of the idea of moral distress? How does that? So just making this a normal thing to talk about. I heard recently of someone I know said they spoke to a doctor who said, I'm off work at the moment and it's due to moral injury. And we both thought,
Mm.
wow, that's how we change things, isn't it? We
Exactly.
normalize this. So I think the starting point could just be maybe just being curious about how this might show up as for an individual, for a team, and yeah, just beginning to be with that idea that if we're open, if we care about our work and we work in challenging circumstances, it's probably going to hurt us at times. And this is
Yes.
normal. This is not anything shameful or any sign of pathology. We have a moral compass. When it's challenged, it can hurt us. So just kind of maybe just spreading that idea.
And that's what we're doing here today,
Yes.
Alison, through Mind Your Mind. And that's what I want to be this podcast, a platform where people can start to hear more about these kind of concepts and start to reflect based on this information. So I want to thank you enormously for being here today with me and
Mm.
having this conversation. I want to thank as well everybody that is out there today listening this podcast. If you found it useful, insightful, please do share it with your colleagues, your managers, everybody in your organizations, and let's get the conversation going, this time about moral injury. So thank you so very much, Alison.
Thank you so much, Roxana. Yeah, wonderful to have the chance to talk with you.